Abigail Hartwell placed the ring on the table without a sound, walked into the November cold, and never looked back. She had seen enough. One doorway, one moment, one image. She could never unlearn her sister in the arms of the man she was supposed to marry in less than a day. She didn't scream, she didn't wait for an explanation, she simply disappeared. And for 5 years, she built a life no one could take from her, including him. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Abigail's journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning of October 14, 1815, was the kind of morning that made a woman believe the world could be decent. The sky above Harbor's Crossing, Massachusetts, came up pale gold over the Atlantic. Salt air moved through the cedar trees behind the Brooks estate, and the white ribbons that had been tied to the porch columns the evening before were still there, fluttering like small surrender flags against the October wind. The whole town had spent the week preparing. There were flower arrangements on the church pews, a new dress sewn by Mrs. Aldrich herself, and enough gossip circulating through every household on the Eastern Shore to fill a year's worth of Sunday sermons. Abigail Hartwell was 20 years old, and she was going to be married. She had told herself more than once that week that she was not afraid. She had told herself that Nathaniel Brooks was a good man, not a perfect one, not an easy one, but a man whose hands were steadier than the sea he built his fortune on, whose voice dropped quiet when the situation called for it, and rose when it needed to. She had watched him over 2 years of courtship, observed the way he treated the men on his docks, the way he listened when her father spoke, even when her father said things that weren't worth hearing twice. She had decided that was what love was. She had decided it wasn't a feeling that happened to you, but a decision you made with open eyes. She was still believing that on the morning of October 14th, when she rose before dawn to fetch her grandmother's brooch from the sewing room on the upper floor of the Brooks estate, where she and Charlotte had been staying the past 3 nights at the invitation of Nathaniel's mother, she did not knock. Later, she would understand that the not knocking was the single detail that changed everything. She pushed open the door to the sitting room at the end of the hall, the room that connected to the small parlor where she had left her grandmother's brooch in the cedar sewing box the afternoon before, and she stopped. Nathaniel was standing near the window. Charlotte was in his arms. Her sister's face was pressed against his chest. Her shoulders were shaking. Nathaniel's right hand rested against the side of Charlotte's face, palm open, the way you would hold something precious and breakable. His head was bent. He was saying something too quiet to hear. Abigail stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds. She counted them later. 1, 2, 3. Neither of them saw her. The candle on the side table was the only light. Charlotte's dark hair was loose and falling over Nathaniel's sleeve. He was still in the clothes he had worn to dinner. Abigail stepped back. She did not slam the door. She turned around and walked back down the hall the way she had come. Her bare feet quiet on the floorboards, her breathing even. Her mind had gone somewhere very still and very cold, the way a river goes quiet just before it freezes from the surface down. She descended the main staircase. She crossed the entry hall. She stopped at the narrow side table near the front door where she had set her engagement ring the previous evening so it would not catch on the blankets while she slept. She picked it up, looked at it for a moment, set it back down. Then she opened the front door and walked out into the October dark. She was wearing her nightgown and her coat over it. She had no shoes. She had no bag. She had nothing except the decision that was already fully formed in her chest. By the time she reached the bottom of the porch steps, the same decision she made, the way she made every decision, not with noise, not with performance, but with the quiet, absolute certainty of a woman who has already seen what she needed to see. She did not go back. The road from the Brooks estate to her father's house was 4 miles along the coastal road. She walked them in the dark, the gravel hard under her bare feet, the Atlantic working itself up somewhere to her left in the blackness beyond the tree line. By the time she reached the edge of town, her feet were bleeding in 2 places, and she did not much care. She did not wake her father. She went to the small room off the back of the house that had been hers since childhood, packed a canvas bag with the things that were hers and only hers. 2 dresses, her writing materials, her mother's Bible, the small amount of money she had saved from her work tutoring the Mercer children over the past year, and she was out the back door and moving toward the post road before the sky had even begun to consider becoming light. The southbound coach stopped at Millhaven Junction at 5 in the morning. Abigail was on it. She was sick on the road. She thought it was the cold, the walking, the shock of the night, catching up to her body. The way shock sometimes does, delayed, thorough, merciless. She stopped in Westbrook for 2 days, then pressed south along the coast, moving by instinct more than plan, the way an animal moves when it has been frightened, far from familiar ground. She did not write to her father. She did not write to Nathaniel. She did not write to Charlotte. She thought about Charlotte once on a gray afternoon somewhere outside of Marblehead, sitting on a damp bench, waiting for a connecting coach that was running 3 hours behind. She thought about Charlotte's hair loose across Nathaniel's sleeve. She thought about the way his hand had rested against her sister's face with such easy familiarity. The familiarity of something ongoing, something known. She thought about it carefully, the way she thought about everything, turned it over, examined it, set it down. Then she made herself stop. There was no version of what she had seen that required her to stay. She had been in the town of Harbor's End for 6 weeks before she understood she was pregnant. She was sitting at the small table in the corner room she rented from Mrs. FTH, a widow who kept a boarding house 3 streets from the water, and asked few questions, which was the primary qualification Abigail had been looking for in lodgings. The morning light was coming through the single window. She had a cup of cold tea in front of her, and a piece of bread she had not eaten. She did the calculation twice. Then she sat very still for a long time. Outside, she could hear the fishing boats coming in, the gulls working over the catch, the ordinary commerce of a town that had been going about its business long before she arrived, and would continue long after. The sounds were somehow steadying. The world apparently intended to keep moving regardless. She placed both hands flat on the table. All right, she thought. Then this is what we are doing. She did not cry. She had not cried since the night she left. She told Mrs. FTH the following morning, not because she owed the woman an explanation, but because she was going to need the room for longer than she had originally said, and she believed in telling people the truth of a situation when it was going to affect them. I am with child, she said. I am unmarried. I have money enough for the coming months if I can find work, and I am prepared to leave if that is your preference, but I would rather stay. Mrs. FTH looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup for a long moment. Can you teach? The older woman said finally. I can teach. Mr. Carroll down at the schoolhouse has been looking for an assistant since March. I'll send him a note. Mrs. FTH set down her coffee cup. You'll stay and you'll take your meals with me. I don't run a house where women eat alone. That was how it started. She taught. She saved. She moved when it became practical. From Mrs. Firth's boarding house to a small rented cottage on the western edge of town, 2 rooms and a kitchen, a yard that backed against a stand of birch trees, a view of the harbor from the upper window if you stood at just the right angle. It wasn't much. It was enough. The boys were born in July of 1816, in the heat of a summer that turned the whole Massachusetts coast thick and airless and unrelenting. 2 of them. She had known there were 2 for months. Mrs. Delaney, who had delivered half the children in Harbor's End over the past 30 years, had told her in the spring with a certain satisfied tone, as though this was personally amusing. Abigail named them Ethan and Lucas. She did not give them their father's name. She thought about that decision for a long time, the way she had thought about leaving, the way she thought about everything carefully from all sides, without the comfort of someone to consult. She thought about the men those boys might come to be, and whether they would one day resent her for it. In the end, she gave them Hartwell, her name, her mother's name, the name that had been handed down through the women of her family since before anyone could remember. You are mine, she thought, looking at them. Ethan, loud and red-faced and furious about the brightness of the world. Lucas, quieter, already looking at things with those dark, considering eyes that would one day stop her breath. You are mine, and I am enough. She was a good teacher. That was not vanity. It was an observation she was willing to make clearly, the same way she would observe that the harbor was deep or the winter was long. She had a talent for it, for finding the exact angle at which a difficult idea would become clear, for knowing when a child needed to be pushed and when they needed to be left alone to find their own footing. The children of Harbor's End learned to read under her watch, and do sums, and write letters to parents and grandparents, and the occasional cousin 3 towns over, and she was proud of that in a quiet, practical way. The town accepted her, not immediately, and not warmly at first. A young woman alone with 2 babies and no husband was not a thing that generated easy welcome in a Massachusetts fishing town in 1816. There were looks, there were whispers she was not intended to hear, but heard anyway. because she had always had excellent hearing and a talent for noticing what people were trying to conceal. She let it pass. She did her work. She was polite without being eager. She did not explain herself to anyone. Over time, the looks stopped. Over time, she became simply Mrs. Hartwell. Not a widow exactly, but a woman whose situation was understood to be complicated and whose competence was beyond dispute. The Mercer family in town brought their children to her, then the Aldrids, then the Coopers. By 1818, she had more students than she could comfortably manage alone and had taken on a younger assistant. She built a life. It was not the life she had planned, and she had made her peace with that. The life she had planned had been built on a foundation that turned out to be made of something less solid than she had believed, and when it collapsed, she had walked away from the rubble and started with the ground underneath. The ground, it turned out, was hers, had always been hers. No one had given it to her. See, Jonathan Pierce came to Harbor's End in the autumn of 1818. She did not know him at first. He arrived with 2 companions in a formal manner and took a room at the Anchor Inn on the Harbor Road. And the first time she saw him was outside the dry goods store on a Thursday morning, loading purchases into a rented cart with the studied efficiency of a man who is trying to look like something he is not. She passed him by, a ghost to his eyes. It wasn't until 3 days later, when Mrs. FTH, with the practiced nonchalance of a woman accustomed to gleaning secrets, casually mentioned it, that Abigail learned who he was. "That man from Boston," Mrs. FTH said, setting a bowl of soup on the table without preamble. "Jonathan Pierce, the Brooks family cousin. Word is, he's been asking questions about you." Abigail's hands froze around her mug. "What kind of questions?" "It's not really a question," she replied. "The kind a man asks when he wants to know if someone is worth finding." That night, after tucking the boys into bed, Ethan sprawled like a fallen acrobat. Lucas curled into a tight, protective ball. Abigail stood at the kitchen table. If Jonathan Pierce was here, then someone had sent him. There was only one person who would have sent him. She stood there for a long time, then, with the bedrock practicality that defined her, began to plan. 2 mornings later, she was in the schoolhouse, her back to the door, writing the day's lesson on the board, November 3rd, 1818. Vocabulary and arithmetic. When she heard the carriage, the rumble of wheels on the road outside, heavier and slower than the usual traffic, a sound that spoke of arrival, not passage. She didn't turn immediately. She finished writing the date, capped the chalk, placed it on the tray, and then, through the schoolhouse window, across the small yard separating the building from the main street, she saw it. A black carriage, drawn by a matched pair of grays, dust still settling around the wheels. The driver stepped down. The carriage door opened. Nathaniel Brooks stepped onto the ground of Harbor's End. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps 5 years had simply solidified something in him, widened his shoulders, steadied his stance, stripped away the last vestiges of youth from his face. He wore dark traveling clothes, his hat in his hand, and he scanned the main street of Harbor's End with an expression she couldn't quite decipher from this distance, but recognized by its shape. It was the look of a man who had been searching for a very long time and was desperately trying to convince himself he had finally found it. She pulled her gaze back to the room. 14 children were watching her. "Open your readers to page 12, she said, her voice steady. "We're beginning with the vocabulary column on the left side." She forced herself to stand before them for another 2 hours, to finish the lesson. But when she turned back to the board to write the next set of words, her hands weren't quite steady, and somewhere on the street behind her, she knew Nathaniel Brooks was already asking someone where the schoolteacher lived. She knew him, and she knew that whatever conversation was coming her way, whatever was unfolding down that road, the life she had built here, the cottage, the students, the birch trees behind the yard, the harbor in the morning light, Ethan and his boisterous laugh, Lucas with his watchful eyes, that life was solid. She had built it herself, with nothing but her own 2 hands, and her refusal to be undone by what she had witnessed in that doorway on the morning of October 14th, 1815. And if Nathaniel Brooks thought 5 years and a carriage could dismantle that, then he had not yet grasped the first thing about the woman she had become. She finished the lesson. That was what she had told herself she would do, and she had done it. Worked through the vocabulary column. Called on Thomas Aldred twice when his attention wavered. Corrected Margaret Cooper's arithmetic with the same even patience she applied to every correction. And when the clock on the wall finally chimed noon, and she dismissed the children with their reading assignments, She stood at the front of the empty schoolhouse and allowed herself precisely 30 seconds to absorb the full weight of what was happening. 30 seconds. Then she picked up her coat, pinned her hair back into place, and walked out the door. He was standing at the end of the road, not directly outside the schoolhouse. He hadn't come that far, which told her something. He was 50 yards down, near the junction where the harbor road met the main street, his back to her, watching the fishing boats make their way in from the morning run. He hadn't seen her emerge. For a moment, just a moment, she could have turned in the other direction, gone home the long way around. She didn't. She walked straight down the center of the road, her heels deliberate on the packed dirt, and when she was close enough for him to hear her, she spoke first. "You should have sent a letter." Nathaniel turned. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She watched him take in the woman she was now, not the 20-year-old girl he had last seen in his parlor doorway, not the person who had packed a bag before dawn and walked into the darkness without a word. Whatever he saw, it moved across his face in layers, one after another, and she made herself stand still and let him look, for she was not afraid of being seen. "Abigail," he said. His voice was the same, lower, perhaps more controlled, but the same. "I know why you're here," she said, "and I'm telling you right now that however this conversation goes, it ends with me walking home to my house and my children, and nothing about that changes. Are we clear? I'm not here to take anything from you. That is not the same thing as being clear." He looked at her for another long moment, then took a breath. "I've been looking for you for 3 years. I know. You knew Jonathan Pierce has been in this town for 4 days asking questions about me. If you sent him to find me, I assumed you weren't far behind." Something crossed his face, sharp, uncomfortable. "I didn't send Jonathan to find you." He stopped, started again. "We need to talk, Abigail. Not here, somewhere private." "No," she said simply. "No. Anything you have to say to me, you say it here, in the open, in the middle of this street. I'm not stepping into a private room with you. I don't owe you privacy." He held her gaze. She remembered that about him. The way he held his ground without aggression. The way he could be still when other men would have shifted, or pushed, or filled the silence with noise. It had been one of the things she had admired about him, once. "All right," he said. "Here then, say what you came to say." He paused. "What you saw that night wasn't what you believed it was." The words hung in the air between them, around them. The ordinary sounds of Harbor's End continued. A wagon passing behind her, someone calling out to someone down near the docks, a dog barking twice and stopping, the world utterly indifferent. Abigail felt something shift in her chest, not softening, not relief, but something more like the dangerous quiet of standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down. She kept her voice flat. "You're going to need to do better than that." "Charlotte found papers," Nathaniel said. "The night before the wedding, documents in my father's desk, contracts. Abigail, legal contracts between my father and yours. The marriage was arranged as a financial instrument. Your father's debts, my father's land interests. They had been negotiating it for 18 months before either of us knew each other existed." She didn't speak. "Charlotte came to me in a panic because she thought you would find out from someone else. She was afraid you would think you had never had a choice. I was trying to calm her down. I was trying to tell her that it didn't matter how it started, that what you and I had built was real and separate from what our fathers had arranged." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "And then you were gone." The silence stretched. "Show me the documents," Abigail said. "I have them. I brought them." "Show me." He reached into his coat and produced a folded packet of papers. He held them out. She took them. She unfolded the first page, standing right there in the middle of the road, and read it slowly, her eyes moving down each line with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. And with every line, something in her chest did something she was not prepared for. Not grief, worse than grief, the particular, nauseating sensation of understanding that the story she had been living for 3 years was built on a missing piece that would have changed everything. She refolded the papers. She did not hand them back. "If you had called for me that night," she said carefully, "if you had come out of that room and told me, I know if Charlotte had knocked on my door. I know. Abigail." 3 years, she said, and for just a moment her voice was not flat at all. 3 years, she agreed. And the way he said it, quiet and final, and without any attempt to defend himself, was somehow the most devastating thing he had said so far. She looked at him for a long moment, Then she said, "You should come to the house." She walked ahead of him. She did not wait, or slow her pace, or make it easy, and he did not ask her to. He fell in behind her at a respectful distance, and she led him through the back streets of Harbor's End, the way she went every day, past the Cooper's yard, left at the birch grove, down the lane that narrowed where the Delaney fence ran close, and stopped at the gate of the cottage. The yard was quiet. It was past noon. The boys would be at the FTH house. She had an arrangement with Mrs. FTH on school days. The older woman watched them through the lunch hour and into the early afternoon. Abigail pushed open the gate and went inside. She did not tell him to follow. He followed. She put the documents on the kitchen table. She put the kettle on. She turned around and found him standing in the middle of the kitchen, looking at the room around him with an expression she recognized, though it took her a moment to name it. He was looking at what she had built, and he was doing what a person does when they come face to face with proof of something they could not have imagined. He was recalibrating. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She made the tea and set a cup in front of him, then sat across the table with the documents between them. "Tell me everything from the beginning," she said. "Everything you know." He told her. It took a long time. He was methodical about it. She had forgotten that about him. The way he ordered information, the way he laid out a sequence of events without editorializing, without the defensive embroidery that most people added when they were explaining how a disaster had occurred. He told her about the morning after the wedding, not waking to find her gone, the ring on the table, the controlled panic of the first hours, his mother's face, Charlotte's devastation. He told her about the search that had started that same day and had not stopped. He told her about the roads he had ridden, the towns he had walked, the people he had spoken to. He told her about the rumors, the ones that said she was dead, the ones that said she had gone south, the ones that said she had been seen in Portland and Plymouth, in a dozen places she had never been. He told her about his father dying in the spring of 1817, and the papers coming to him after, and understanding, for the first time, the full architecture of what the two families had built around them. He told her about Jonathan. That was when she went still. "Jonathan Pierce," she said. "Tell me specifically." Nathaniel's hands closed around the cup in front of him. "When my father died, the estate came to me. All of it. Jonathan had expected. Our grandfather had promised him, or Jonathan believed he had promised him, a portion of the shipping concerns. When the will was read, there was nothing for him. Everything went to me. And so, Jonathan began very quietly to look for leverage. Abigail looked at him steadily. And my children are leverage." The word leverage landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Nathaniel set down the cup. "If the boys can be established as illegitimate," he said carefully, "if Jonathan can demonstrate in court that I have no legitimate heirs and no acknowledged family obligation, then the inheritance challenge becomes viable." Abigail said, "Yes, and you didn't come here out of love, Nathaniel. You came here because Jonathan Pierce is about to drag my children into a courtroom." He looked at her directly. "I came here because I never stopped looking for you. Those are not the same situation, and I won't pretend they are. But yes, Jonathan is moving, and he is moving fast, and if we are not ahead of it, Abigail said. He stopped. She let the words sit there. "You've been gone for 3 years, she said, very quietly. "My sons don't know your name. I have built everything in this house with my own hands, and I have asked nothing from anyone, and the first time you walk into this town, you start talking about Abigail Hale. I am not finished." Her voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. "You are going to tell me exactly what Jonathan Pierce said to you, exactly what legal maneuvers he has prepared, and exactly what your presence in this town is going to cost me and my boys before I decide what any of this means. And you are going to understand something. Whatever I decide, it is my decision, not yours, not Jonathan's, not the court's, mine. Are we agreed?" A long silence. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "We are agreed." She heard them before she saw them. Ethan's laugh came through the cottage gate like an announcement, loud and unself-conscious. The laugh of a boy who had never in his life worried about being too much, followed by the lower murmur of Mrs. FTH behind him, saying something that was probably, "Wipe your feet, young man," followed by Lucas's quieter voice, saying something she couldn't make out from the kitchen. She had exactly 3 seconds. She looked at Nathaniel across the table. He had gone completely still. "Stay in your chair," she said. "Don't speak unless I ask you to. And do not look at them the way you are looking right now, because I will not have them confused by a man they do not know." He nodded once. He straightened. He composed his face into something neutral. The door opened. Ethan came through first, the way Ethan always did. Everything first, fast, committed, dropping his school satchel on the floor by the door and turning toward the kitchen before he even fully registered that there was someone sitting at the table who was not supposed to be there. He pulled up short. His eyes went to the stranger, then to his mother, then back. "Who's that?" he said. Ethan did not phrase questions gently. "A visitor," Abigail said. "His name is Mr. Brooks. He's come from Boston on some business." Lucas had come in behind his brother, quiet as always, and he was standing in the kitchen doorway now with his school satchel held in front of him, with both hands, looking at Nathaniel with those dark, careful eyes that never missed anything. Nathaniel was looking at his sons. Abigail watched him do it, watched him see Ethan's jaw, which was his own jaw, watched him see Lucas's eyes, which were his own eyes, watched the full weight of 5 years land on him in a single moment. His hand on the table did not move. His face did not change, but something happened to him. She could see it the way you see wind move through a field, not the wind itself, but the evidence of it. Something happened to him that was large and permanent and would not be undone. He did not speak. "Mr. Brooks is going to have dinner with us," Abigail said, because she had made the decision while she was still watching him process the sight of his children for the first time. Not out of mercy, out of the practical understanding that dinner was the safest territory, that ordinary domestic ground was what this situation required. "Ethan, go wash your hands. Lucas, hang your satchel." Ethan gave Nathaniel one more direct, measuring look, the look of a 7-year-old boy who has appointed himself the security concern of the household, and then went to wash his hands. Lucas did not move immediately. He was still looking at Nathaniel. And Nathaniel was looking back at him, very carefully. "The way you look at something that matters. You came a long way," Lucas said. His voice was quite precise. He had always spoken like that, choosing his words with a seriousness that belonged to someone twice his age. "I did," Nathaniel said. "Why, Lucas?" Abigail said quietly. "It's all right," Nathaniel said. He looked at the boy steadily. "I came because there are some things that matter enough to travel for." Lucas considered this for a moment. Then he hung up his satchel and went to wash his hands beside his brother. Abigail turned to the stove. Her hands were not shaking. She had made sure of that. But she stood there for a moment longer than necessary over the pot, long enough to breathe, long enough to remind herself of what she knew, that she was the one who had built this life, that she was the one who had kept these boys safe, that no carriage arriving from Boston and no set of legal documents and no pair of familiar dark eyes across her kitchen table changed the fundamental fact that she was the one who decided what happened next. She was still deciding. Jonathan Pierce came to the schoolhouse the following morning. She had been expecting it. When a man like Jonathan, careful, strategic, accustomed to using the shape of things rather than the substance, when a man like that had been in a town for 4 days, the direct approach eventually became unavoidable. He would have preferred to work from the edges, to gather information and apply pressure through channels that kept his hands clean. But Nathaniel's arrival had changed the timeline. He came at 7 o'clock in the morning, before the students arrived, and he knocked on the schoolhouse door with the polite, unhurried knock of a man who expects to be let in. She opened the door. Jonathan Pierce was lean and fine-featured, a year or two older than Nathaniel, with the kind of face that arranged itself easily into expressions of courtesy. He had clearly come from money, and was wearing it the way men from money wore it, not loudly, but with a specific quality of assumption that ran through every detail. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I believe you know who I am." "I do," she said. She did not step back to let him in. "I wonder if we might speak privately." "You may speak here," she said. "I have 15 minutes before my students arrive." He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "Very efficient. I appreciate that." He put one hand in his coat pocket. "Casual, deliberate. I'll be direct then, since time is short. I have been authorized to offer you a settlement, a sum substantial enough to relocate your family comfortably, somewhere south perhaps, or west if you prefer. There would be no legal proceedings, no public unpleasantness, no questions asked about the circumstances of your children's birth." "In exchange for what?" Abigail said. "In exchange for your written acknowledgement that Nathaniel Brooks has no paternal claim to your sons, and your agreement to have no further contact with the Brooks family." Abigail looked at him. She thought about what it would have meant 3 years ago. The money, the escape, the clean, quiet disappearance into somewhere new. She thought about who she would have had to be to take that offer. A different woman. A woman who believed her only option was to run. "No," she said. Jonathan's pleasant expression did not change. "You should take time to consider." I said no. She held the door. "You have about 12 minutes left before my students arrive, Mr. Pierce, and I'd suggest you spend them walking back to wherever you came from, because this conversation is finished." He looked at her for a long moment. Then the pleasant expression shifted, not to anger, not quite, but to something colder and more calculated underneath. "You understand," he said quietly, "that if this goes to court, the questions about your sons will be public. This town will hear every detail. Your position here, your school." "I understand exactly what you're threatening," Abigail said, "and I want you to understand something in return. I have spent 3 years building my life in this town, and there is not one person in Harbor's End who does not know exactly what kind of woman I am. You may bring whatever you like into a courtroom. The truth is not afraid of daylight." She took a step forward. He held his ground, but only barely. "Get off my doorstep, Mr. Pierce." He left. She closed the door. She stood in the empty schoolhouse with her hands at her sides, and the blood moving fast through her veins, and the absolute clarifying certainty of a woman who has made up her mind. She was not running. Not this time. Not ever again. She found Nathaniel at the Anchor Inn that evening after the boys were in bed and Mrs. Firth had come to sit with them. She walked through the inn's front room without looking at the other people eating their suppers and knocked on the door of the room the innkeeper had told her was his. He opened it immediately, as though he had been standing close to it. "Jonathan came to the schoolhouse this morning," she said. "I know, he told me. He offered me money to disappear." "I know that too." Nathaniel's voice was tight. "Abigail, I did not send him here. I did not authorize." "I know you didn't." She looked at him steadily. "I know the difference between what you do and what he does. I always have." She paused. "I told him no." Something moved through Nathaniel's face. "I'm not running," she said. "I don't know yet what I'm willing to do about the rest of it, about you, about what you told me yesterday, about any of that. I haven't decided. But I am not letting Jonathan Pierce erase my sons from their own lives, and I am not disappearing so that man can take what isn't his. So if there is a legal fight coming, then it is coming, and I intend to be standing in it." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "I will stand next to you," he said. "I haven't asked you to." "I know," he said quietly. "I'm telling you anyway." She stood in the hallway outside his door, and she thought about the ring on the entry table, and the cold October road under her bare feet, and the 2 small faces sleeping in the cottage at the end of her lane. She thought about every morning she had gotten up before dawn and made something out of nothing, and every evening she had sat in the silence of her own small house and known that she had done it herself. She thought about Lucas's face at the kitchen table. "You came a long way. Why?" And Nathaniel's answer, which she had not been able to stop thinking about since the moment he said it, "Because there are some things that matter enough to travel for." "I'll come by in the morning," she said. "We need to talk about the documents and what Jonathan is likely to file, and where this case will go. If we are going to fight this, I need to understand the full picture. I'll be here." She turned to go. "Abigail." She stopped, did not turn. "I'm sorry," he said. "For all of it. For every day. I know that doesn't fix anything." She stood still for a moment in the hallway. "No," she said. "It doesn't." And she walked out. But she did not walk out the way she had walked out of the Brooks estate on the morning of October 14th, 1815, with nothing in the dark toward nowhere. This time she walked out knowing exactly where she was going, and for the first time in 3 years, she was not walking alone. She came to the inn at 7 o'clock in the morning with the documents under her arm and a list of questions she had written out by lamplight the night before, after the boys were asleep and the cottage was quiet enough to think. Nathaniel opened the door before she knocked. She chose not to comment on that. She sat at the small table by the window. He sat across from her. She put the documents between them, and her list beside them, and said, "Walk me through the legal timeline. What has Jonathan filed? What is he preparing to file? And how much time do we have?" Nathaniel looked at the list. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite grief, something in between. "You made notes. I always make notes. Answer the question." He answered the question. Jonathan had not yet filed anything formally. He was still in the gathering phase, still collecting testimony from people who had known Abigail in Harbor's End, still building the framework of his argument. His strategy, as Nathaniel understood it, was to establish two things simultaneously. First, that the boys were Nathaniel's sons, and therefore potential heirs. And second, that because Abigail and Nathaniel had never married, the boys' claim to the Brooks estate could be challenged, controlled, and ultimately redirected, which would open the door for Jonathan's own inheritance challenge. "He needs the boys to be yours," Abigail said slowly. "But he also needs them to be illegitimate." "Yes, that's a narrow road to walk. Jonathan is good at narrow roads." She looked at the documents. "And you have the original contracts, the ones between our fathers. I have everything that was in my father's desk when he died, including correspondence." Nathaniel paused. "Including a letter my father wrote to yours in the spring of 1815, 6 months before the wedding, in which he explicitly references the financial terms of the arrangement." Abigail went still. "You're telling me there is written proof that the marriage was a business transaction?" "Yes." "And you brought it?" "I brought all of it." She sat with that for a moment. The letter changed things. The letter meant that if this went to court, Jonathan's version of events, that Abigail had run from a legitimate engagement out of instability or deception, had a direct counter. The letter meant there was a documented reason for what she had done. "Why didn't you use this before?" she asked. 3 years of searching. Why not use the documents? Using them meant making public what our fathers did. Nathaniel said it meant putting your name in the middle of a legal proceeding when I didn't know where you were or whether you were safe. I wasn't willing to do that without—" He stopped. "Without your agreement." Abigail looked at him. She had built very strong walls over the past 3 years, practical, necessary walls, the kind that keep the weather out and let you function. She was aware that this particular statement of his was doing something to one of those walls, and she chose not to examine it directly. "All right," she said. "Here is what I know. Jonathan came to me with a settlement offer yesterday, which means he does not want a public fight. He wants this quiet, which means he believes a quiet resolution favors him and a loud one does not. If he believed he had an airtight case, he would already be in the courts." She tapped the documents. "What we have here frightens him." "I think so too." "Then we don't hide. We go forward." She looked at him across the table. "I need you to understand something, Nathaniel. If we do this, if we go forward together and use these documents and stand in front of whatever court Jonathan chooses to bring this to, there is no version of that process that doesn't put my children in the middle of it. Their names, their birth, everything I have protected them from for 5 years becomes part of a public record. I know, and I need to know," she said carefully, "that you understand who they are. Not heirs, not legal instruments, not a means to defeat your cousin. They are my sons, they are children, and their lives do not exist to serve this story." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "What are their names?" She paused. It was such a simple question, so direct. And somehow the simplicity of it, the fact that he asked for the names before anything else, before the legal strategy, or the inheritance, or the plan, reached through the practical, careful architecture she had built around herself, and found something underneath it that she was not entirely prepared for. "Ethan," she said, "and Lucas." He repeated the names quietly, not to her, to himself, as though he was memorizing them. "Ethan," he said. "The loud one. Ethan has never met a room he didn't immediately decide to own," Abigail said, despite herself. Something softened in her voice. "And Lucas. Lucas watches everything. He is going to be someone extraordinary, and he already knows it, which in a 7-year-old is either a gift or a problem depending on the day." Nathaniel looked at his hands. "I want to know them," he said, "not as a legal position, as a person who is their father. I understand I have not earned that. I understand there is a long road between where I am right now and where I would need to be for that to be possible. I'm not asking for forgiveness or for time to be given back, or for anything you don't choose to give. I'm just telling you that it is what I want, so that you know what you are dealing with when you look at me." The room was quiet. Outside, Harbor's End was beginning its morning in earnest. She could hear the docks, the carts, the voices of people starting their day with no knowledge of the particular weight of this particular conversation. "I know what I'm dealing with," Abigail said, and her voice was more even than her chest was at that moment. "I always knew what you were. That was never the question." She stood and gathered the documents. "I'll speak to Mr. Carroll today about covering my students for the next few days. We need to go through everything you brought, and we need to send word to a solicitor in Boston before Jonathan files anything formal." She moved toward the door. "Come to the house at noon. We'll work through the afternoon." "Abigail," she stopped. "Thank you," he said, for not running. She considered that for a moment. Don't thank me yet, she said. Jonathan Pierce hasn't shown us his worst yet. She was right about that, but she did not know, walking out of the Anchor Inn in the pale November morning of 1818, that the worst was already in motion, and that it would arrive from a direction she had not been watching. Charlotte arrived in Harbor's End on the third day. Abigail was in the cottage kitchen with Nathaniel, a map of the Massachusetts court circuits spread between them, and a draft letter to a Boston solicitor in her handwriting to her left, when she heard the gate. She looked up. Through the window, she saw the figure coming up the yard path, and every careful thing she had built inside herself over the last 3 days cracked clean down the middle. Her sister, Charlotte Hartwell, was 24 now, 3 years older than the girl who had been crying in that candlelit room at the Brooks estate, and the years had not been entirely kind to her face in the way that guilt rarely is. She was thinner. Her eyes, when she raised them as Abigail opened the door, had the look of someone who has rehearsed this moment 1,000 times and is now realizing that none of the rehearsals were adequate. "Abby, Charlotte," Abigail said, just that one word, and then she stepped aside, because she was not the kind of woman who sent people away from her door, even when she wanted to. Charlotte came inside. She saw Nathaniel at the table and went absolutely still. "Sit down, Charlotte," Abigail said. "Both of you sit down. I am going to make tea, and nobody is going to say anything that is not factual and useful until it is poured." She made the tea. She poured it. She sat. Then she looked at her sister and said, "Explain." Charlotte explained. It came out in pieces, not because she was being evasive, but because guilt of a certain weight and duration tends to organize itself badly, in fragments and circles, kept alive by a person's need to justify themselves, even when the justification has long since stopped working. But eventually, through the fragments, the full shape of it emerged. Charlotte had found the contracts 3 days before the wedding. She had been looking for stationery in the elder Brooks's study. She had wanted to write a letter to a friend in Providence, and the papers had been in the top desk drawer, carelessly left, rather than locked away, the way aging men sometimes become careless with secrets they have kept for years. She had read enough to understand. She had panicked. "I should have come to you," Charlotte said. Her voice was low and raw. "I know that. I have known that every single day since. I should have knocked on your door and put the papers in your hands, and let you decide what to do. But I was afraid of what you would do. I was afraid you would call it off, and I was afraid. You were afraid Father would suffer for it," Abigail said, not unkindly. "Because the financial arrangement was protecting his debts." Charlotte flinched. "Yes. And so you went to Nathaniel instead, to ask him to manage it quietly. I thought he could. I don't know what I thought. I thought he would know what to do, and I walked in," Abigail said. "And you walked in." Charlotte's eyes went wet. "I heard the door. I heard you on the stairs. And by the time I got to the hall, you were already gone. We looked for you that whole night. Nathaniel rode out before dawn." "I know," Nathaniel said quietly. "I tried to tell Father. He wouldn't believe you had truly left. He kept saying you would come back in a few days once you'd calmed down." Charlotte looked at Abigail directly. "I am sorry. I have been sorry every day for 3 years, and I know that means nothing against 3 years. But I needed to say it to your face." Abigail sat with that, the honest thing, the thing she had the dignity to admit to herself, sitting at her own kitchen table in her own cottage that she had built herself, was that the anger she felt toward Charlotte was not as clean as the anger she had carried for 3 years. Because the woman across the table from her had been 21 and frightened and trying to protect their father, and had made a terrible choice from a place of love rather than malice. That did not erase 3 years. That did not give back the October road under her bare feet, or the solitude of 2 pregnancies and 2 births with no family present, or the 1,000 mornings she had gotten up alone. But it changed the shape of the thing. "You're going to stay," Abigail said finally. Charlotte blinked. "I'm what?" "You're going to stay in Harbor's End. Jonathan Pierce is building a legal case that, if it proceeds, is going to put this entire family in public view. If you go back to Boston, he will use you as a witness against us. If you stay here, you are a witness for us. You have direct knowledge of what happened that night. You can testify to the contracts, to the conversation with Nathaniel, to everything." Abigail looked at her sister steadily. "You owe me 3 years, Charlotte. This is how you start paying." Charlotte swallowed. "Yes," she said. All right, yes. You'll stay at Mrs. FTH's. I'll send word ahead. Abigail stood and began clearing the tea things. We have work to do. It was that afternoon. Charlotte settled at Mrs. FTH's, the boys home from school and performing their careful, separate assessments of their aunt, who they had never met, with Ethan deciding she was acceptable within 20 minutes, and Lucas reserving judgment in that particular way of his, that Nathaniel found Abigail in the backyard. She was hanging the laundry. It was the most ordinary possible thing she could be doing, and she was doing it because ordinary things were sometimes the only mechanism she had for keeping herself level. "Can I help?" he said. She handed him the other end of a sheet without looking at him. They worked for a moment in silence. Then he said, "How are you?" "I'm fine, Abigail." She glanced at him sideways. "I'm not all right, but I am functioning, which is the main thing. Seeing Charlotte was something I'd been dreading for 3 years, and now it's behind me, which is a relief, even if it doesn't feel like one yet." She pinned the sheet, reached for the next. "I'm not ready to forgive her. I may not be ready for some time, but I'm not going to let my anger at her be the thing that loses this fight. You've thought about all of this. I've thought about everything." He was quiet for a moment. "Then the boys were asking about me this morning." She stopped. "What do you mean?" "Ethan came out to the yard before you were up. He asked me directly. He said, 'Are you the reason we don't have a father?'" Abigail closed her eyes briefly. "He didn't. He absolutely did. In exactly that tone. The tone that means he has been thinking about it since the moment I walked in, and he's decided the direct approach is more efficient than waiting." Despite everything, something in her chest did a thing she was not prepared for. A sudden, unwilling warmth, because that was Ethan entirely. That was her son to his bones. "What did you tell him?" she said. "I told him." Nathaniel said carefully that I was someone who had made mistakes and was trying to understand if it was possible to make them right, and that I was not there to take anything from them or from their mother, and that whatever happened, it would be their mother who decided it. Abigail looked at him. "Then he asked if I knew how to fish," Nathaniel said. "And when I said yes, he said I could stay for breakfast." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Then the gate at the end of the yard opened, and Jonathan Pierce walked in. He did not knock. He did not call ahead. He walked straight into the yard with 2 men behind him, men she did not recognize. Men with the specific quality of people who are paid to stand behind other people and say nothing. And he stopped 10 feet from where she and Nathaniel stood with the laundry between them. "I apologize for the interruption," Jonathan said. He did not sound apologetic. "I've just come from a meeting with the county recorder. I wanted to inform you personally, Nathaniel, that I have filed a preliminary motion in the Court of Essex County, challenging the validity of the Brooks estate succession on the grounds of illegitimate and unacknowledged issue." His eyes moved to Abigail. "The filing specifically names the Hartwell children. Their full examination will be required." Abigail felt the cold go through her. Not fear, something more focused than fear. The specific, clarifying anger of a mother who has been told that her children are going to be put in the middle of something they did not cause. "You filed today," Nathaniel said. His voice was controlled, dangerously controlled. "As of this morning, I'm afraid the timeline for a quiet resolution has passed." Jonathan's pleasant expression had the particular quality of a man who is enjoying himself and wants you to know it while maintaining plausible deniability. "I did offer Miss Hartwell a settlement. She declined." "You threatened her," Nathaniel said. "I offered her a choice." Jonathan looked at Abigail. "That offer remains on the table. Incidentally, the motion can be withdrawn if—" "Get out of my yard," Abigail said. The words were quiet, absolute. The same tone she had used at the schoolhouse door. The same tone she had been using for 3 years when the world tried to make her smaller than she was. Jonathan's pleasant expression held. "Miss Hartwell," I said, "get out." She took 2 steps forward. The men behind Jonathan shifted. She did not slow down. "You have filed your motion. You have delivered your message. You are now trespassing on my property. And if you are not through that gate in the next 10 seconds, I will have the town constable here before you reach the road. Are we finished?" Jonathan held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned and walked back through the gate. The 2 men followed him. The gate closed. Silence. Nathaniel was standing very still behind her. She turned. His face had gone through several things in the last 90 seconds, and had settled on something that looked, underneath the anger, like something she hadn't seen on him before. "What?" She said nothing, he said. "Only—" He stopped. "Nathaniel, I was going to say," he said quietly, "that I have been looking for you for 3 years, and I am standing here watching you face down a legal threat in your own backyard, with the laundry still in your hands. And I need you to know." He stopped again. "I need you to know that I understand now what I cost you, not just the years, all of it. What you had to become to survive what I failed to prevent. And I am." His voice went quiet. "I am so sorry that you had to be this strong alone." The yard was very still. The laundry moved in the wind between them. Abigail stood with the anger still moving through her bloodstream from the last 10 minutes, and his words sitting somewhere underneath it in a place she had been keeping very carefully locked. And she thought about all the right things to say, the measured things, the self-protective things, the things that kept the walls where they needed to be. She said, "None of them." "We have a solicitor to reach before evening," she said. "And I need to talk to the constable about Jonathan's filing before tomorrow morning. And at some point today, I need to sit down with the boys and tell them." She stopped, swallowed. "Tell them something. I haven't decided what yet." "Tell them the truth," Nathaniel said. "They're 7. They're your sons," he said. "Which means they can handle more than you think." She looked at him for a long moment. "Come inside," she said. "We have work to do." He followed her, and this time when she moved through the kitchen door, she did not think about whether he was behind her. She already knew he was. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, working through the afternoon over documents and draft letters, while the boys played in the next room, and Charlotte settled into Mrs. FTH's spare room down the lane, was that Jonathan Pierce had not come to the yard to deliver a message. He had come to see how they would respond, and he had seen exactly what he needed to see. That evening, the first story appeared in the Gloucester Courier, a brief item halfway down the 3rd page, phrased in the careful language of public record, but unmistakably deliberate in its construction. A legal motion has been filed in Essex County regarding the succession of the Brooks estate. The matter involves the alleged natural children of Nathaniel Brooks of Boston and a Miss Hartwell currently residing in Harbor's End, under circumstances that the motion describes as concealed and irregular. The Gloucester Courier was read in every household within 30 miles. By the following morning, every person in Harbor's End knew. By the following morning, the war had truly begun. The newspaper was on her doorstep before she was dressed. She found it when she opened the front door at 5 in the morning, the way she opened it every morning to check the weather before starting the fire. It was folded and placed deliberately, not tossed, not dropped, but placed centered on the top step, the 3rd page facing up with the item already visible. Someone had wanted her to find it first thing. She picked it up, read it once, set it on the kitchen table, made the fire, put the kettle on, read it again. Then she sat down and allowed herself exactly the amount of time it took for the water to boil, to feel the full weight of what Jonathan Pierce had done. Alleged natural children, concealed and irregular. 2 phrases, carefully chosen, legally vague enough to be unprovable, as slander specific enough to do their work in the imagination of every person who read them over their morning coffee. She had been in Harbor's End for 3 years. She had built her reputation here with the same patience and precision she brought to everything, one student at a time, one neighbor at a time, one honest interaction at a time, and Jonathan Pierce, with 8 words in a regional newspaper, had taken a crowbar to the foundation of it. The kettle boiled, she made the tea. When the boys came down, she was sitting at the table with her 2nd cup, and her expression arranged into something steady. Ethan read the room immediately, he always did, and sat down without his usual thunder, watching her with those sharp eyes. Lucas sat beside him and said nothing, which was how Lucas said everything. "Is something happening?" Ethan said. "Yes," Abigail said. "Something is happening, and I'm going to explain it to you. But I need you both to listen all the way to the end before you ask questions. Can you do that?" Ethan looked at Lucas. Lucas gave a small nod. "Yes, ma'am," Ethan said. She told them, not all of it. Not the contracts, not the full architecture of the legal motion, not the financial warfare between old men that had set all of this in motion before either of them had drawn a first breath. She told them the parts that were theirs to know. She told them that Mr. Brooks was their father. She told them that she and their father had been separated by a misunderstanding a long time ago, and that she had chosen to raise them here in Harbor's End on her own. She told them that a man named Jonathan Pierce was trying to use their family to take something that did not belong to him, and that their names were in a newspaper because of it, and that people in town might say things in the coming days that were unkind. She watched their faces while she talked. Ethan went through anger, confusion, and a return to anger in approximately 90 seconds, which was consistent with his general processing speed. Lucas went somewhere quieter and deeper, and she knew he would not surface from it for some time. When she finished, Ethan said, "He's actually our father, yes. And he came here to find us. He came here for several reasons. That was one of them." Ethan thought about this. "The fishing," he said. Abigail blinked. "What?" "He offered to take us fishing yesterday, when you were inside." Ethan looked at her, with the particular expression of a 7-year-old working out a logical chain. If he was just here for legal reasons, he wouldn't have said that. Abigail looked at her son and felt something move through her that was not easy to name. "No," she said carefully. "He probably wouldn't have." Lucas had not spoken through any of this. Now he looked up from whatever internal place he had been in and said, "What does irregular mean?" She went still. "It means," she said, "that someone is trying to make our family sound like something shameful, and it is not." "I know it's not," Lucas said simply. Then he picked up his spoon and went back to his porridge, as though the matter was settled, because for Lucas, apparently, it was. The town divided by noon. That was how fast it happened. That was the thing about a small town with a newspaper and a story that had all the ingredients people required. Wealth, scandal, a woman alone, children without a recognized father, a powerful man's arrival. By the time Abigail walked to the schoolhouse at 7, she could feel it in the way people looked at her on the road. Some of the looks were the old ones, the warm, familiar nods of people who knew her and had known her for 3 years and had made their decision about her character long before this week. Those people looked at her directly, steadily, with the specific quality of folks who are telling you without words that they are not moved. But some of the looks were different. Mrs. Cooper, whose daughter Margaret had been Abigail's student for 2 years, crossed to the other side of the road rather than pass her on the walk. A man she did not know well, a newcomer, a merchant who had set up near the docks 6 months ago, stood outside his shop and watched her go by with an expression. She recognized the look of someone performing the calculation of which side it is safer to be on. She kept walking. The schoolhouse buzzed with a palpable energy when she arrived. 22 children, each one privy to their parents' hushed conversations that morning. All eyes fixed on her with that peculiar blend of unwavering loyalty and hesitant uncertainty that clouds a child's gaze when the adults in their world waver. She stood before them, a silent affirmation blooming in her chest. "These are my students. This is my classroom. And no matter what Jonathan Pierce might be spinning in Essex County, it would not touch what transpired within these 4 walls." "Good morning," she announced, her voice steady. Page 14. Let's begin. The day held, but the afternoon fractured. As she walked home at 3, the Cooper boy, not Margaret, but her older brother, 16, and already bearing the sturdy build of his father, a man who toiled daily at the docks, stepped from the alley beside the barrel maker's shop. Loud enough for the 2 women ahead of Abigail to hear, he declared, "My mother says you're a liar." Abigail stopped, turning to face him. He wore the look of a boy dispatched on an errand by someone older, now grappling with a flicker of regret in the actual presence of his target, yet too committed to retreat. She held his gaze for a long moment. "Your mother," she stated quietly, "has known me for 3 years. When Margaret came to me, unable to write her own name, I sat with her every afternoon for 6 weeks, until she could. When your mother was ill in the winter of 16, I brought food to your house 3 times and asked for nothing in return." She didn't break his stare. "Whatever your mother has decided this week, she knows who I am, and so do you." The boy remained silent. Abigail turned and continued her walk home, her hands, buried deep in her coat pockets, trembling. Not from fear. She needed to be clear about that. It wasn't fear. It was fury. The clean, bright kind that surges when you've poured years of effort into something, only to watch someone try to dismantle it for no reason other than avarice. She had done everything right. She had been decent, diligent, honest, and present, never asking for a single thing from anyone that she hadn't earned. And Jonathan Pierce, with 1 day and 8 words, had sought to unravel 3 years of her labor. Nathaniel was at the cottage when she arrived. He was in the yard with Ethan, who, it seemed, had decided yesterday's fishing invitation was still on the table, having already retrieved a pair of cane poles from the storage shed. They were threading line when she came through the gate. Ethan looked up, his expression one of hopeful anticipation, as if awaiting permission. "Can we go to the harbor?" Ethan asked, adding that he knew where the striped bass ran this time of year. Abigail's gaze drifted to Nathaniel. He met her eyes, and she knew, though her hands were still now, that he had seen their tremor. He said nothing about it. "An hour," she replied. "Before dark. Stay on the public dock." Ethan was already bounding toward the gate. Nathaniel paused beside her. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Abigail." "I'm angry," she said, her voice a low murmur. "I'm very angry, and I am not going to aim that at you right now, because you are not the appropriate target. Go take my son fishing. I'll talk to Charlotte about the solicitor's response while you're gone." He nodded and left. She stood in the empty yard, allowing herself 30 seconds of unobserved fury. Then, she went inside. The solicitor's name was Mr. Henry Ames, and his letter arrived the following morning from Boston, delivered swiftly, indicating Nathaniel had sent an urgent rider. Ames's missive was brief, professional, and the news was grim. Jonathan's filing was technically sound. His legal argument hinged on 3 points: that Nathaniel had failed to acknowledge his sons for over 2 years after their existence became common knowledge, that Abigail's departure from the Brooks estate without documented cause suggested a voluntary relinquishment of any legal or moral claim, and that the boys, as unacknowledged issue, could not be recognized as legitimate heirs without Nathaniel's formal legal declaration, which Jonathan intended to challenge on the grounds of Nathaniel's lack of timely action once informed. "He's arguing that your inaction invalidates your claim," Abigail said, reading the letter aloud to Nathaniel across the kitchen table. Charlotte sat beside her. "That you knew, or should have known, about the boys, and didn't immediately seek legal acknowledgement." "I didn't know where they were," Nathaniel said. "I didn't know there were boys at all until I walked into this cottage. Jonathan will argue that you should have found them faster. He spent 3 years letting people believe she was dead, rather than helping search for her." Charlotte interjected sharply. "He knew you were looking, Nathaniel. He knew, and he said nothing. He had resources." "Can you prove that?" Abigail asked. Charlotte paused. "Can you prove that Jonathan knew something about where I was, and chose not to tell Nathaniel?" Abigail looked directly at her sister. "Because if you can, that changes everything." The ensuing silence was of a particular kind, the kind that signals a person is carefully weighing how much to reveal. "Charlotte," Abigail pressed. "There was a man." Charlotte spoke slowly. "In the spring of 1816, he came to the house. I was still living at Father's house. He said he worked for Jonathan and was asking questions about you, where you might have gone, who your friends were south of Boston, whether you had family anywhere along the coast." She stopped. "I told him nothing, but the questions he asked were specific, Abigail. The kind of questions you ask when you already have a lead and are trying to verify it, not the kind you ask at the beginning of a search." Abigail's hands came to rest flat on the table. "He already knew," she stated. "I think so. I think he knew, or was very close to knowing, where you were by the spring of 1816. And I think he chose not to tell Nathaniel because as long as you were unfound, the inheritance situation remained favorable to him." The kitchen fell utterly still. Nathaniel's face had taken on a pallor that was neither white nor any other distinct color. "He knew," he said, his voice quiet, like the hushed breath of a fire just before it fully catches. "This is what we bring to Ames," Abigail declared, already reaching for paper. "Charlotte testifies to the investigator's visit. We request the court compel disclosure of any investigators Jonathan employed between 1815 and 1818. If we can demonstrate that Jonathan had access to information about my location and suppressed it from Nathaniel, his entire argument about Nathaniel's failure to act in a timely fashion collapses." "He'll deny it," Charlotte said. "Let him deny it under oath," Abigail countered. "That is what courts are for." The hearing was set for December 14th in Salem. They had 3 weeks. What transpired in those 3 weeks would have fractured a lesser household. The initial newspaper item was followed by 2 more, each subtly sharper than the last, each clearly fed by someone close to Jonathan, with a penchant for incremental damage. The second questioned whether Abigail had resided in Harbor's End long enough to fall under the relevant county statutes. The third, and most brutal, ran under the headline, "Children of Disputed Origin at Center of Brooks Estate Challenge," and it named the boys, Ethan's name, Lucas's name, in print. Abigail read it at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning, and this time, she allowed herself no 30 seconds of introspection. She was afraid that if she started, she wouldn't stop. She folded the paper, fed it to the fire, and made the tea. When Nathaniel arrived at 8, she told him, watching his face register the impact, the way it did when something struck him at a fundamental level, the tightening jaw, the stillness, the particular quality of a man steeling himself to channel destructive impulses into something useful. "I want to go to the Courier," he said. "Absolutely not. Abigail, you go to that newspaper angry, and you give Jonathan exactly the spectacle he craves. You sit down at a desk and you write. You write a formal public statement acknowledging Ethan and Lucas as your sons, witnessed and signed, and deliver it to the Courier for publication. You do not argue. You do not attack. You state a fact." She met his gaze. Facts are harder to fight than feelings. He sat down. He wrote the statement. It appeared 4 days later, 11 lines, clear, formal, unambiguous. "I, Nathaniel Brooks, of the Brooks Shipping Concerns of Boston, Massachusetts, do hereby formally and publicly acknowledge Ethan Hartwell and Lucas Hartwell as my sons, born of Abigail Hartwell of Harbor's End, and declare my full paternal responsibility for their welfare and future." 11 lines. Mrs. Firth read it aloud at the breakfast table and wept openly, a fact she would have vehemently denied if asked. 3 of Abigail's students arrived at the schoolhouse the next morning with notes from their parents. Not notes about the unfolding drama, but ordinary missives, the kind that said, "Mary has a cough. Please keep her from the cold window," and Thomas forgot his arithmetic page. "Here it is," Abigail murmured, "the ordinary commerce of trust." Continuing, Mrs. Cooper's daughter Margaret came back. Abigail said nothing about it. She simply pointed Margaret to her usual seat and continued the lesson. Jonathan Pierce arrived at the schoolhouse for the second time on a Thursday morning, 8 days before the hearing. This time he was not alone. He was accompanied by a man who introduced himself as Mr. Greer, and who possessed that particular look of a lawyer, something in the eyes, a quality of constant calculation. "We would like to speak with the children," Jonathan stated. The words struck the room like a thrown object. Abigail stood at the front of her classroom, 22 children behind her. She took a single step forward, positioning herself squarely between Jonathan Pierce and every child in that room. When she spoke, her voice was so controlled it bordered on pleasant. "You will not," she said. "Miss Hartwell, as part of the Essex County proceeding, my children are 7 years old. They are not parties to this case. They have not been subpoenaed. They have not been summoned. And you have not been granted any court authorization to approach them directly, because if you had, you would have led with that document instead of walking into my classroom with a lawyer and a smile." She advanced another step. "Get out of my school." Mr. Greer countered carefully. "Any attempt to obstruct the courts, any attempt to interrogate children, without their legal guardian present, and without a court order, is what will be obstructed." Abigail replied, "You're welcome to file a motion. I will respond to it. In the meantime, you are frightening my students, and you have 5 seconds. Jonathan's eyes flickered past her to the rows of children. Something shifted in his expression. Not conscience, not precisely, but the dawning recognition of a tactical miscalculation. Coming to the schoolhouse had been a mistake, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it. He left. The door closed. Abigail turned back to her class. 22 pairs of eyes, all fixed on her. In the third row, Ethan's jaw was set in a way that so precisely mirrored Nathaniel's that it was briefly difficult to look at him. In the second row, Thomas Aldred, 9 years old, gap-toothed, the most reliable barometer of the room's collective mood, slowly began to clap. Within 3 seconds, every child in the room was clapping. Abigail stood at the front of her classroom, a resolute thought forming. "You do not get to take this from me." "All right," she said. "That's enough. Open your readers." The twist came 4 days before the hearing, and it arrived from an entirely unexpected direction. Mr. Ames traveled from Boston in person, the first indication that the news was significant. He arrived at the cottage at 7 in the evening, removed his hat, accepted a cup of tea, and placed a document on the table with the deliberate care of a man delivering something that would fundamentally alter the situation. "We have the investigator," he said. Abigail went still. Nathaniel looked up. "A man named Cutler, currently employed by a shipping firm in Providence," Ames said. "He was hired by Jonathan Pierce in January of 1816 to locate Miss Hartwell. He found her, confirmed her location in Harbor's End in March of 1816. March of 1816. The boys had been born in July. Nathaniel was on his feet. He knew. Nathaniel said he knew she was here for 2.5 years before he knew. Ames confirmed. And Mr. Cutler, when approached by our representative, was willing to provide a sworn affidavit. It appears Jonathan has recently declined to pay the remainder of his fee, which has materially affected Mr. Cutler's loyalty. The room was very quiet. Abigail looked at the document on the table. She thought about March of 1816. She thought about every morning from March of 1816 forward, the hundreds of mornings she had gotten up alone and made something out of nothing, while a man in Boston sat on the knowledge of where she was and chose his own inheritance over the truth. She thought about Lucas's birth and Ethan's, both of them arriving in the July heat with Mrs. Delaney, and no one else, no family, no one who shared their blood in the room. "Is it enough?" she said. Her voice was steady. "Combined with Charlotte's testimony about the investigator's visit and the contracts between your father's and Nathaniel's formal acknowledgement," Ames said. "Yes, Miss Hartwell, I believe it is enough." She nodded once. "Then we will be ready on the 14th, she said. After Ames left, the cottage was quiet. Charlotte had taken the boys for the evening. She had been doing that more often over the past week, the two of them building something careful and tentative that Abigail was watching without comment. The kitchen was just her and Nathaniel, and the document on the table. Nathaniel said, "I owe you 2.5 years more than I thought." "Yes," she said. "You do, Abigail." "Don't," she said quietly. "Not unkindly. Not tonight. Tonight I need to think about the hearing and what Ames needs from me, and how to make sure the boys are somewhere safe on the 14th, so they don't have to sit in a courthouse." She looked at him. "We are not finished, you and I. There is a great deal still between us that has not been said, and will need to be, but not tonight." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. She picked up the document from the table and brought it to the lamp to read it again carefully, line by line. Outside Harbor's End was going about its evening, the docks settling, the last light going out in the houses along the harbor road, the Atlantic doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous and permanent. Abigail read the affidavit. She read it again, and for the first time since the black carriage had appeared on the road outside her schoolhouse, she felt something that was not anger and not fear, and not the grinding forward motion of a woman who has no choice but to keep moving. She felt, quietly and carefully, and without letting herself put too much weight on it, something that felt like the edges of a door opening. She was not through it yet, but she could see the light. The morning of December 14th arrived, the way hard days tend to arrive quietly without announcement, with the ordinary sounds of a world that does not adjust itself for what is about to happen inside it. Abigail was awake before the fire needed tending. She lay in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the cottage breathe around her, the particular silence of a house where 2 small boys were still sleeping, the creak of the board settling in the cold, the Atlantic working at the shore somewhere behind the birch trees. She had been living in this cottage for 2 years. She knew every sound it made. She had learned them the way you learn the sounds of something you are responsible for, attentively, permanently. She got up, she made the fire, she made the tea. She was dressed and at the kitchen table with her notes when Charlotte came down at 5, already carrying her own coat. "The boys," Abigail said, still sleeping. "Mrs. FTH will be here at 6 o'clock. They'll go to her house for the day." Charlotte sat down. She looked at her sister across the table with the particular expression she had been wearing for the past week, a composite of guilt and determination, and the daily effort of a person who has decided to make themselves useful as a form of penance. "How are you?" "I'm ready," Abigail said. Charlotte looked at her for a moment. "Abby, whatever you're going to say, save it until tonight," Abigail said, not unkindly. "I need everything I have today for the courtroom. There's nothing left over for anything else." Charlotte nodded. She understood. That was one of the things that had shifted between them over the past 3 weeks. Charlotte had stopped trying to have the conversation before it was time, which was a form of respect that Abigail was quietly noting. Nathaniel knocked at 6, which was when they had agreed. And when she opened the door, he looked at her with an expression that asked a question without words. She answered it the same way, a single nod that meant, "Yes, I'm ready. Let's go." And she picked up her coat and her document case and walked out of the cottage into the December morning without looking back. She would look back tonight. Tonight would be for looking back. Today was for going forward. The Essex County Courthouse in Salem was a 3-hour ride, and they arrived with 40 minutes to spare, which was exactly the margin Abigail had planned for. Mr. Ames was waiting outside with his clerk, a young man named Tobias, who had ink on 2 fingers and the focused expression of someone who has been awake since 4 in the morning, doing exactly the kind of detailed preparation that wins cases. "Jonathan arrived 20 minutes ago," Ames said quietly. "He has 2 lawyers, Greer and a man from Boston named Whitfield. Whitfield is expensive." "Is he good?" Nathaniel said. "He is very good," Ames said. "Which is why we are going to be better." He looked at Abigail. "Miss Hartwell, I need to remind you your testimony will be the center of this. Not the documents, not the affidavit, not Charlotte's account. You. The court needs to see who you are, not who Jonathan has described in his filings." "I know who I am," Abigail said. "Then let them see it," Ames said simply. They went inside. The courtroom was not large. The winter light came through the high windows at a low angle and fell across the room in long, cold bars. The gallery had perhaps 30 people in it, more than she had expected for a preliminary motion hearing, which meant the Courier's coverage had done its work. She recognized 2 faces from Harbor's End. She did not let her eyes linger. Jonathan Pierce was already seated at the plaintiff's table with Greer and Whitfield on either side of him. He looked up when they entered. His face arranged itself into the pleasant expression she had come to understand as his working mask. The one that said, "I have no personal feeling about this. It is merely a legal matter." And he nodded once in the way people nod when they are performing civility. Abigail did not nod back. She sat down. She placed her document case on the table in front of her. She folded her hands on top of it. Beside her, Nathaniel was still across the aisle. Jonathan began a quiet conversation with Whitfield. The judge entered at 9 o'clock precisely. His name was Judge Calb Marsh, and he was 60-something with the look of a man who has heard a great many arguments and is not easily impressed by any of them. He settled into his chair, reviewed the papers in front of him for a long moment, and said, "This is the matter of Pierce versus Brooks, regarding the succession challenge to the Brooks estate. Is counsel present for both parties?" Both parties confirmed. "We'll begin with the plaintiff's presentation," Marsh said. "Mr. Whitfield." Whitfield stood. He was good. Ames had not been wrong about that. He was precise and measured, and he built Jonathan's case the way a careful carpenter builds a structure from the foundation up. Each piece fitted exactly to the next. He established the terms of the Brooks estate. He established Nathaniel's failure, as he called it, to formalize any acknowledgement of the Hartwell children prior to the previous month's public statement. He established that Abigail had left the Brooks household without documentation, without explanation, without any legal record of cause. He used the phrase, "voluntary abandonment of the established arrangement," twice. He used the phrase, "children of disputed legitimacy" once. That once was enough. Abigail felt Nathaniel's hand close briefly over hers under the table. She did not pull it away. She let it stay for 3 seconds, exactly long enough to accept what he was offering. And then she moved her hand back to the document case. She needed her hand steady. When Whitfield sat down, Ames stood. He began with Charlotte. Charlotte took the witness stand with her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap, and the particular quality of a woman who is terrified and doing it anyway, which was, Abigail thought, the bravest Charlotte had ever been. She testified to the night before the wedding, the contracts, the panic, the conversation with Nathaniel, the misunderstanding that had ended everything. She testified to the investigator's visit in the spring of 1816, to the questions the man had asked, to the specificity of his knowledge. She testified to the fact that she had told no one of Jonathan's investigation and had not understood its significance until recently. Whitfield cross-examined her for 20 minutes. He was thorough. He was relentless. He questioned her memory, her motives, her relationship with Abigail, her presence in Harbor's End, her reasons for coming forward now rather than 3 years ago. Charlotte answered every question. She did not deflect. She did not embellish. She told the truth in the plainest possible language. And when Whitfield tried to lead her toward inconsistency, she simply said, "That is not what I said," and repeated exactly what she had said. When she stepped down, she met Abigail's eyes across the room. Abigail gave her a single nod. Charlotte's eyes went bright for a moment. Then she studied. Mr. Cutler's affidavit was read into the record by Tobias, because Cutler himself was in Providence, and had provided a notarized statement rather than appearing in person. Whitfield objected to its admission. Marsh reviewed it for 2 long minutes and overruled the objection. Whitfield objected again. Marsh said, "Noted, overruled," in the tone of a man who will not be spending more time on this. The affidavit established that Jonathan Pierce had hired Cutler in January of 1816, that Cutler had located Abigail in Harbor's End in March of 1816, that he had confirmed her identity and her situation. The woman is living as a schoolteacher under her own name. She appears to be with child or recently delivered. She has not made contact with the Brooks family, and that he had delivered this information directly to Jonathan Pierce and had received payment for it. March of 1816, 19 months before Jonathan had made any legal move. 19 months of knowing and saying nothing. 19 months of letting Nathaniel search while sitting on the answer. The gallery had gone very quiet. Jonathan Pierce across the aisle had not moved. He was still wearing the pleasant expression, but something underneath it had shifted. Abigail could see it the way you can see a foundation shift before the wall above it shows the crack. He had not anticipated Cutler. He had not anticipated the unpaid invoice becoming someone else's leverage. Ames let the silence work for a moment. Then he called Nathaniel. Nathaniel took the stand and answered every question the way he answered every question, directly, without embroidery, without the defensive performance that the situation might have licensed. He testified to the contracts his father had kept, to his own ignorance of them until his father's death, to the 3 years of searching, to the morning he had arrived in Harbor's End, and understood for the first time that he had sons. He testified to what Jonathan had known, and when he had known it. Whitfield cross-examined him hard. He asked about the years of inaction. He asked why, if Nathaniel had been so desperately searching, it had taken him until 1818 to locate Miss Hartwell, when she had been living under her own name in an accessible Massachusetts town. He asked whether Nathaniel's sudden interest in his sons was connected to the inheritance challenge rather than to genuine paternal feeling. Nathaniel looked at Whitfield steadily. "My cousin knew where Abigail was for 2.5 years and did not tell me," he said. "When I ask myself why it took me until 1818, that is the answer. He is sitting at that table, you might ask him." A sound went through the gallery. Marsh raised his hand. The gallery settled. Whitfield moved on. Then Ames called Abigail. She stood. She walked to the witness stand. She sat down and looked out at the room, at Nathaniel, at the table where Charlotte sat, in the gallery at Jonathan, with his lawyers, at the 30 people she did not know who had come to watch. And she made a decision that she had been in truth-making for 3 weeks. She was going to tell the truth, all of it, not the legally strategic version, not the version shaped for maximum effect, but the plain version, because she had nothing to hide and never had. And she was finished with the premise that the circumstances of her life required defense. Ames began simply. "Miss Hartwell, can you describe the events of the night of October 13th, 1815? She described them. She described the doorway, and what she had seen, and what she had understood, and what she had done. She described the walk in the cold. She described the coach at Millhaven Junction. She described Harbor's End and Mrs. Firth, and the schoolhouse, and the cottage, and the July morning when Ethan and Lucas had arrived into the world, with all the noise and insistence that characterized them. She described the 3 years she had spent building a life with her own hands and asking for nothing from anyone. She did not frame it as tragedy. She did not frame it as triumph. She described it the way she described everything, clearly, factually, with the economy of a woman who respects the truth enough not to dress it up." Then Ames asked, "Miss Hartwell, did you at any point conceal the identity of your children's father with intent to defraud or damage the Brooks estate?" "No," she said. "Did you leave the Brooks household in October of 1815 with any intent to deny Nathaniel Brooks access to his children?" She paused. She wanted to get this exactly right. "I left," she said, "because I believed I had seen proof that the man I was going to marry had betrayed me with my own sister. I did not know I was with child when I left. When I understood that I made the decision to raise my children independently, because I had no reason to believe the foundation of their father's commitment was solid. That decision was mine, and I stand by it." She looked directly at Judge Marsh. "I did not hide. I lived under my own name in a town 30 miles from Boston. Anyone who wanted to find me could have found me. The reason Nathaniel Brooks did not find me sooner is sitting at that table with 2 lawyers. Another sound from the gallery. Marsh did not quiet at this time. Whitfield came at her for 30 minutes. He questioned her judgment. He questioned her fitness. He implied carefully that a woman who abandoned an engagement hours before the ceremony and raised children in secret was not a stable foundation for any legal or moral claim. He used the word impulsive twice, and the phrase acting without counsel 3 times. Abigail answered every question. She did not raise her voice. She did not become defensive. She answered each question with the specific, grounded precision of a woman who has had 3 years to know her own mind, and is not confused by someone else's version of it. When Whitfield called her decision to leave impulsive, she said, "A woman who removes herself from a household where she believes herself betrayed, who travels alone and supports herself and raises 2 children to health and education on a teacher's salary, is not acting impulsively. She is acting with the only resources available to her." When he called it acting without counsel, she said, "I was the counsel. That was sufficient." The gallery was very quiet. When Whitfield finally sat down, he did not look satisfied. Judge Marsh recessed for 1 hour. Abigail sat in the hallway on a wooden bench with Charlotte on one side and Nathaniel on the other, and she did not speak. She was wrung out in the way that telling the truth in public will wring a person, not ashamed, not uncertain, simply emptied of the specific energy that honesty at that scale requires. Charlotte put her hand over Abigail's, and this time Abigail did not move hers away. Nathaniel was looking at the floor. "Whatever he decides," Abigail said. "I know," Nathaniel said. "My life is not contingent on this outcome. I know that too." He looked at her. "But I want you to know, regardless of the ruling, what Jonathan did these 2.5 years. We will deal with that later." Abigail said, "Tonight, when the boys are in bed and we have time to say it properly." He held her gaze. "Tonight," he agreed. When Marsh returned and the courtroom settled, and the judge opened the papers in front of him and began to read, Abigail sat straight in her chair with her hands folded and her breathing even, and she thought about Ethan at Mrs. Furr's. Right now, probably interrogating Mrs. Furr's about something she didn't want to be interrogated about. She thought about Lucas, probably drawing in the margins of whatever book Mrs. Furr's had given him to keep him occupied. Those careful, precise lines of his that already looked like something real. She thought, whatever happens in this room, I am going home to them tonight. That was enough. That had always been enough. Marsh said, "The court finds that the plaintiff's challenge to the Brooks estate succession is not supported by sufficient evidence to proceed. The affidavit of record establishes that the plaintiff had material knowledge of the location and circumstances of Miss Hartwell and her children for a period of no less than 2 years prior to this filing, knowledge which he withheld from the acknowledged father. The plaintiff's argument regarding Nathaniel Brooks's failure to act in a timely fashion therefore fails on its foundational premise." He turned a page. The court further finds that the contracts presented by the defense establishing the arranged nature of the original engagement between the Brooks and Hartwell families and Charlotte Hartwell's testimony regarding the events of October 13, 1815, provide adequate grounds to establish that Abigail Hartwell's departure from the engagement was neither fraudulent nor indicative of moral turpitude. He looked up from the papers. "The motion is denied in its entirety. The succession of the Brooks estate remains with Nathaniel Brooks. Court costs are assessed to the plaintiff." He looked across at Jonathan Pierce. "Mr. Pierce, I would further note for the record that the withholding of information relevant to a father's search for his children, which is what this affidavit establishes, is something this court views with considerable gravity. Should further evidence emerge regarding the nature and extent of that withholding, this court would be prepared to hear it." He closed the folder. "We're adjourned." Jonathan Pierce left the courtroom without looking at any of them. His lawyers followed. The gallery began to move and talk around them. Ames was saying something to Tobias. Charlotte had both hands over her mouth. Nathaniel was standing very still beside Abigail with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not relief, exactly, not triumph. Something quieter and more private than either of those. The expression of a man who has been carrying something for 3 years and has just been allowed to set it down. Abigail stood. She thought she would feel more than this, some great rush of something, some overwhelming release. Instead, what she felt was clean, simple, like a window that has been stuck for a long time, finally opening and letting the air through. She picked up her document case. Charlotte threw her arms around her from the side, which Abigail had not been prepared for, and for a moment she stood in her sister's embrace, and felt the full weight of what Charlotte had done today, the courage of it, the cost of it, and she let herself hold it. "We're not finished," Abigail said into Charlotte's shoulder. "You and I, there's still a great deal." "I know," Charlotte said. Her voice was thick. "I know that," Abigail said, "but today was good. What you did today was good." Charlotte pulled back and wiped her face with the back of her hand, which was exactly the gesture she'd been making since she was 12 years old. And Abigail had a sudden, sharp memory of her sister at 12, the impulsive, bright-eyed girl who had loved too loudly and thought too late. And she thought, "I have missed you. Even when I couldn't afford to, I missed you." She did not say it yet, but she held it. 3 hours from Harbor's End on the return road, Nathaniel said, "I want to ask you something." The carriage was moving steadily. Charlotte was asleep in the opposite corner, or doing a reasonable impression of it. The winter dark was coming down outside. "Ask," Abigail said. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight is for the boys, and for coming home, and for whatever conversation you said we would have when they were in bed. I'm not asking tonight." He looked at her. "I'm telling you, I'm going to ask so that you know it's coming, so that you have time to think about it if you need to." "Nathaniel, I know what I want," he said quietly. "I know what I am asking, and I know it is not a simple question, and I know the answer may not be what I want it to be, and I know that whatever you decide, I will respect it. But I am telling you that I am going to ask, because I believe you deserve to know that it is coming, rather than having it arrive without warning." Abigail looked at him in the dark of the carriage. She thought about October 14th, 1815, the ring on the table, the cold road under her bare feet, the canvas bag with everything that was hers and only hers. She thought about July of 1816, and Ethan's voice arriving in the world like a declaration, and Lucas's eyes opening and looking at her with that already considering gaze, and her own hands shaking and steady at the same time. She thought about every morning in between. "All right," she said, "I'll think about it." He nodded. Outside, Massachusetts moved past them in the dark. The boys were still awake when they arrived at Mrs. Furr's, despite Mrs. Furr's evident best efforts. Ethan heard the carriage from inside and was at the door before Abigail had finished climbing down, his coat half on, his eyes going immediately to her face to read the outcome. "Well," he said. Ethan did not believe in preamble. "We won," Abigail said. Ethan let out a sound that was not quite a word, something between a shout and a breath, and threw himself at her with the full-bodied commitment that characterized everything he did. She caught him, staggered slightly, held him over Ethan's shoulder. She saw Lucas standing in the doorway with Mrs. Furr's behind him. He was watching his mother and his brother, and then his eyes moved to Nathaniel, who was standing a few feet away, and something passed between them, the boy and the man, in the cold December dark. And Lucas stepped off the porch and walked across the yard and stopped in front of Nathaniel. "You came back," Lucas said. "I said I would," Nathaniel said. Lucas looked at him for a moment with those particular eyes of his. Then he said, "Are you staying this time?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Nathaniel looked past Lucas to Abigail. She was still holding Ethan. She met his eyes. "That," Nathaniel said carefully, looking at her, "that's something your mother and I will be discussing tonight." Lucas considered this. "That means probably yes," he surmised. "People only say we're going to talk about it when the answer is yes, but they're not ready to commit just yet." Mrs. Firth made a sound from the doorway that was suspiciously close to a laugh. Abigail looked at her son, her 7-year-old son, who had his father's eyes and her own sharp mind, and she thought, extraordinary. She had told him she'd spoken with Nathaniel after the boys were tucked in. She'd sent Charlotte to the sitting room with a book and a candle, and she and Nathaniel sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, the cottage hushed around them, and she had said, "Ask." He asked, not in the way she'd anticipated, not with the formal language of a business proposal or the confident pronouncements of a wealthy man laying out terms. He asked like someone who had waited a long time, who had weighed every word with care, and had decided that the unvarnished truth was the only version worth speaking. He told her he wasn't asking her to relinquish anything she had claimed for herself, not her independence, not the cottage, not the school, not the life she had meticulously crafted in Harbor's End. He told her he wasn't asking to be the center of her world. He wasn't asking to be needed. He was asking if there was a space within the life she had built for the choice of him. Not because she was obligated, not because the boys desperately needed a father, though they did, and he yearned to be one, but because he had loved her at 20, across a parlor in a Boston house, and had loved her for every year since, and was now standing in her kitchen, asking if that love held any weight at all. Abigail absorbed this for a long moment. The fire crackled. The cottage seemed to breathe around them. "You understand," she said, "that everything I have built here is mine. The school, this house, this life. It doesn't become yours simply because I know. And the boys will decide in their own time what they wish to call you, what you are to them. I will not dictate it. I know that too. And I am not 20 years old," she said. "I am not the woman who stood in that doorway. I am considerably less patient than she was, more difficult, and I have very little tolerance for those who are not direct with me." "I noticed," he said. Something stirred within her, that same reluctant warmth that had been subtly working at the edges for 3 weeks, patient and persistent, like water shaping stone. "I will not give you my answer tonight," she said. He nodded. "But I am not saying no." He grew very still. "I am saying," she continued carefully, "that I need time, that what I saw in that doorway 3 years ago left something within me that doesn't simply vanish with an affidavit and a court ruling. And I am unwilling to build something new on top of ground that isn't fully cleared." She paused, then started again. "I need to see who you are here. Not in Boston, not in a courtroom, not in a crisis. Here, in this town, with those 2 boys. Ordinary mornings, ordinary difficulties. I need to see that before I can tell you what is possible." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Then, "I'll stay," he said, "in Harbor's End. For as long as it takes," he added, "however long you need. I'll find work. I have shipping connections. There are merchants along this coast who would welcome a partnership. I'm not going back to Boston to wait for your answer in a letter." He held her gaze. "I'll be here. You can watch." She looked at him. "All right," she said. She stood. She picked up the lamp. She walked to the hallway leading to the boys' room and stopped, turning back. "Nathaniel," he looked up. "Thank you," she said, "for not making me run again." He met her gaze. "You were never going to run," he said quietly. "You stopped running a long time before I got here. I just needed to catch up." She stood there for another moment. Then she went to check on her sons, her boys, her Ethan and her Lucas, sleeping in the small rooms of the cottage she had built for them from nothing but her own refusal to be less than who she was. She listened to their breathing in the dark, and she thought about the road ahead, the long, ordinary road of trust rebuilt painstakingly, and a family forged not from circumstance but from deliberate choice. It would not be easy. She knew that nothing truly worthwhile ever was. But she was Abigail Hartwell. She had walked out of a burning wreckage in the dark, barefoot and unguided, and had built something solid from the ground up, and she had never once needed saving. She didn't need it now. What she needed, what she was, for the first time in 3 years, willing to consider wanting, was a partner, an equal, a man who had finally learned to be worth the distance she had placed between them. She looked at her sleeping sons. She made her choice, and this time, she was the one to decide.